and welcome to our latest Birds Meet webinar for the Urban Bird team at BirdLife Australia. It's wonderful to have everybody along using a different system today. So bear with us as we get used to using Teams webinars instead of our standard Zoom. We hope things go relatively smoothly. There's a few differences if you've been to Zoom meetings versus Teams webinars. I think we might get started. So there'll still be some people joining us tonight as we go, as happens with Zoom as well. But for everybody else, I just wanted to say hello to another Birds Meet webinar session. Tonight we're talking about urban development, a big topic and one that we're really passionate about. So we're really excited that we've got Jacinta to talk about her research with us tonight. For those who don't know me, I'm Holly Parsons. I'm the Urban Bird Program Manager for BirdLife Australia. So I oversee the programs that are all about the birds that live where people live, and we run a series of research, education and conservation projects. Hopefully people can hear me. I can see there's a few people. Yep, I've got some nods. That's great. A few people have lost sound. Hopefully you can get back in. We've also got Annie Namo with us tonight, who's going to be helping out as well. Annie's our Urban Bird Program Coordinator too. But before we get started with the actual session, I wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that everybody's calling in on tonight. I am joining you from Dharawal country, which is just south of Sydney. I'm in Wollongong, where, like many of you, summer has come quite early in the last couple of weeks, but I'm seeing a lot of springtime activity amongst our birds as well. I'll just ask everybody just to pop themselves on mute. And I know those little buttons, the little waiting in lobby admitting buttons are beeping for everybody, and apologies for that. We'll see if we can work out how to mute that. But let's get started. I wanted to introduce our speaker for this evening. We have joining us Jacinta Humphries. Jacinta is a PhD student with the Research Centre for Future Landscapes at Trobe University. I've known Jacinta for quite a few years now, and so I'm really excited to have her along. Oh, I can hear my echo. Somebody is just, there we go, we're muted out again. So we're going to hear about Jacinta's PhD work tonight, but ultimately what Jacinta's hoping to do is develop recommendations for local governments and residents on how to better support native bird life in our suburbs. And so we're going to be learning about some of the work she's doing to get us to that point. Jacinta has a range of interests. It is, of course, urban ecology, but she's also interested in threatened species management and new and exciting ways to communicate with the general public, so to do science communications. And I've seen Jacinta speak many times, and she's always delightful. She's really passionate about making urban spaces more wildlife friendly, and hopes ultimately, like we all do, to have greener, more sustainable cities and towns around Australia. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to welcome Jacinta to the session.
Awesome. Thanks, Holly. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. All right. I will just bring up my slides for this evening. Wonderful. Can we all see that now? Yes, I'm getting some nods. Excellent. Okay, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you online tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we're meeting this evening. So tonight I'm speaking on the unceded lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, which is down in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous people who may be joining us or watching this recording at some point in the future. And because we are talking about the birds this evening, I'd particularly like to acknowledge the important contribution that First Nations people make to the management and conservation of our Australian native birds. So as Holly mentioned, this evening, I'm going to be talking about my research into how birds respond to urban development. If you do have any questions at all, and you missed Holly's little demonstration, I would recommend that you scan the QR code that's up on the screen now. If you don't have a device that can do that, I think Annie is going to put a link in the chat, which you can use, and we'll be kind of collating all the questions, and then I'll get to them at the end of my presentation. So, in November last year, our planet hit a new milestone when the global human population reached 8 billion people for the first time in our history. This ongoing population growth is resulting in urbanization, a process which alters natural environments by removing native vegetation and replacing it with all the things that we depend on: houses, shops, and roads. Urbanization is one of the leading causes of land use change worldwide and is now considered a major threat to native biodiversity. To give you an idea of what this process looks like, I'm going to show you some aerial photos of Melbourne. So this is an aerial photograph taken above Melbourne's northeastern suburbs in the year 1945. For those of you that are located in Melbourne, this is the area around present-day Greensborough, just near La Trobe University, where I study. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where this photo was taken. This example is indicative of the type of change that has occurred in so many of our cities and towns across Australia. The main thing I want you to take away from this slightly grainy image is the lack of houses. There are a couple of pockets of residential development here and there across this photo, but most of the landscape is just open paddocks and patches of remnant bushland. This is what it looks like today. Throughout Greater Melbourne, and indeed many of our cities and towns, we've seen a huge increase in the housing density and number of small suburban streets. We can see in this photo alone that we've got several large shopping precincts and industrial areas that have appeared, and the patches of habitat that remain in this landscape are now much more obvious and much more isolated. The point I'm trying to make here is that a lot can change in 75 years. And whilst that might seem like a long time in our lifetimes, 75 years in the context of evolutionary time is nothing. This landscape has changed dramatically in the blink of an eye, and the wildlife that have inhabited this land for thousands of years simply have not had time to catch up. And this isn't just a problem that we've observed in the past, this is absolutely ongoing and accelerating. So today, more than half of the world's human population live in urbanized cities and towns, and this is expected to increase significantly over the coming decades. Here in Melbourne, the state government is now predicting that our population, which is sitting at around 5 million people, is going to reach 9 million with 3.2 million homes by the 2050s. So it's pretty clear that urbanisation is a big issue, not just in a global sense, but right here in our own backyards. However, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, cities are home to a great diversity of species, especially birds. In fact, many cities around the world are considered hotspots for biodiversity, so it's certainly possible for wildlife to persist in these highly modified environments. The big question is, how can we best support our native wildlife as our population continues to grow? And this is where my PhD comes in. My PhD research aimed to investigate the impacts of urbanisation on bird communities. I wanted to understand how bird communities change in response to two different features of the urban landscape. Firstly, housing cover, which represents our ongoing urban development, and tree cover, which represents available habitat for many species of birds. Tonight, I'm going to talk about 4 different aspects of my research, which look at the influence of these two variables on overall bird diversity, or the number of different bird species that live in one suburb, individual species responses, the composition of bird communities, that is, the particular assemblage of birds that coexist together within a suburb, and finally, the occurrence of both noisy miners and a group of birds that I'm going to call bush birds. As Holly mentioned, I wanted to develop some recommendations for how to best design and manage residential areas to provide additional habitat for native birds and eventually work towards bird-friendly suburbs. So to achieve this, I chose to survey birds in residential suburbs of Melbourne with representatives of both of high, medium and low housing cover. In addition to these three housing categories, I also chose to survey along a continuous gradient of tree cover. So I had examples of low, medium and high tree cover for each of my housing cover categories. And in total, I selected 30 suburbs where I was going to go out and survey for birds. Each of these suburbs was a circular area that covered 1 square kilometre or 100 hectares. And importantly here, I wasn't trying to target areas where I thought I'd get really great bird diversity or really poor bird diversity. My choice was entirely based on the characteristics of the suburbs. So I was hoping to find some areas that I felt were representative of Greater Melbourne. Within each suburb in my circular area, I established 10 survey sites, which were spaced approximately 200 metres apart. So these were the areas where I was going to go and do my bird surveys in the field. Most of these sites were located on residential streets, so just like the street that you live on. But I also had some that were in urban parklands, riparian areas, so that's the area of vegetation that runs alongside a creek, and also in patches of native vegetation, so potentially some areas of woodland or forest. At each site, I conducted a 10-minute point count to record any species of birds that I could see or hear within a 40-metre radius from where I was standing. And overall, I conducted 5 survey rounds over a period of 16 months from September 2018 to December 2019. And my surveys looked a little bit like this. So this is me standing out at a site on a particularly cold Melbourne morning. You can't see it in the photo, but I have a stopwatch around my neck, which I was using to accurately time my 10-minute survey. And with my clipboard and trusty data sheets, I'm writing down any birds that I can see or hear within 40 metres from where I am. So what birds did I find? Over the course of my 1,500 surveys, I recorded a total of 76 different bird species, and this included 71 Australian native birds and 5 exotic or introduced species. The most commonly recorded birds included ones that you have probably seen in your own backyards at home, but these were the noisy myna, Australian magpie, common or Indian myna, spotted dove, the red wattlebird, little raven, rainbow lorikeet, and the grey butcherbird. So all 8 of these species were recorded in over 20% of my surveys at more than 180 sites across Melbourne, and they were present in all 30 suburbs I visited. So they're all very widespread, doing very well. Now I'm going to move on to the first part of my PhD, which looked at overall bird diversity, or the number of different bird species that occurred within one suburb. Here, I was really interested to know what properties of a suburb or features might be influencing the diversity of birds that live there. So when I talk about properties or features of a suburb, I'm talking about physical aspects that make up my 1 kilometre squared or 100 hectare area. So I was looking at things like housing cover and tree cover, which I've also already mentioned. But also things like the proportion of tree cover that was made up of exotic trees, so trees that are not native to Australia. Also things like the total cover of parkland within a suburb and the cover of riparian areas, which, as I said earlier, were the strips of vegetation that follow creeks and rivers. And in addition to these, within these properties within each of my suburbs, I also wanted to know what was going on in the area immediately surrounding each suburb. Because obviously, some birds will travel great distances and move between different suburbs regularly. So I also looked at the extent of surrounding native vegetation within a 1 kilometre radius of each suburb. This evening, in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on two groups of birds, which were the Australian native birds, which had 71 different species, and a subset of these that I'm going to call bush birds. So I recorded a total of 30 species that we classified as bush birds. And these were birds that were known to be dependent on native vegetation. So that could be areas of woodland, forest, or even heathland as well. So starting with the native birds, the number one driver of native bird diversity in a suburb was the amount of housing cover. So this graph is showing that we've got housing cover on the x-axis down the bottom, and then the number of different species in a suburb on the y-axis. And as we can see, as housing cover increases, we've got a significant decline in the number of bird species I recorded within that suburb. When we focus solely on bush birds, we can see there's a very similar trend. Not quite as many species, of course, but still that steady decline in the number of different birds with more and more housing. And we believe that this is because housing cover is taking up valuable land, thereby limiting the amount of suitable habitat that's available within a suburb. So unlike some introduced birds, bush birds are simply not going to use human infrastructure as habitat. They're not going to build a nest in your gutters. They're not going to get into your roof and use that as a home. So the presence of houses is kind of displacing other habitat types that might be more suitable for them. So places like our urban parks and our native vegetation patches. Of course, housing cover also comes with a whole heap of other disturbances like people and pets. So there's a range of things going on. Interestingly, there was one other factor that was also found to be really important for the diversity of bush birds, and this was the amount of native vegetation within the 1 kilometre radius around each suburb. So the more vegetation that we had around a suburb, the greater the diversity of bush birds that I was seeing. And we believe this is because these natural areas are operating as source populations. So whilst bush birds do turn up in our suburbs and our backyards, it's likely that their core habitat, so the area where they breed and they find most of their resources, is probably in these larger patches of native vegetation that are often around the fringes of our cities, at least certainly here in Melbourne. That's where they tend to occur. And those places are super important. So looking at the number of different species in a suburb is a good starting point. But as you may have noticed yourselves in your own gardens, not all birds respond to urban development in the same way. Many species are negatively impacted by expanding development, but others can actually benefit from this change. So I felt it was really important to drill down to the individual species level and look at how each individual bird was responding to both housing cover and tree cover within a suburb. And there's already been a little bit of research in this area in the past. So in the early 2000s, some scientists actually came along and categorized Melbourne's birds into 3 groups or assemblages based on their level of tolerance to urbanization. And these are collectively known as urban avoiders, adapters, and exploiters. So when thinking about these 3 groups, I find it's easiest if you imagine them occurring along a gradient. So our urban avoiders, as their name suggests, tend to avoid suburbs as much as possible. They don't particularly like it here. They're not finding the resources they need. Urban adapters fall somewhere in the middle. They do like some aspects of our suburbs, and they will hang around from time to time. And our urban exploiters, as we might expect, love life in the suburb.
Hang on, Jacinta, we've just lost your audio. Just give me a second, sorry. Let's see, can we unmute?
Can you hear me?
There we go, you're back.
Someone must have accidentally muted me. That's fine.
Thanks, Jacinta.
Okay, so if I start off by thinking about housing cover and how individual birds might respond to housing cover, we know that it was a really important driver for species diversity. So the graphs that I'm going to show you this evening all have what I'm calling the predicted reporting rate on the y-axis. And this is basically just the likelihood of that bird species occurring in a suburb. And they'll either have housing cover or tree cover on the x-axis. So starting with our urban avoiders, and one example being our striated pardalote here, these guys showed a really strong negative relationship with housing cover, which we might expect to see. They want to avoid urban spaces. And they were rarely recorded in suburbs that had more than 20% housing cover. They just disappeared entirely and were not found in those areas. Then we have the urban adapters like the crimson rosella here, and they showed a similar trend. They were less likely to occur in suburbs with more housing cover, but they were a little bit more tolerant of increasing urbanisation. They were still hanging around in areas where we had up to around 30% housing cover. And finally, our urban exploiters, like the spotted dove here, which is an introduced species, showed a positive relationship with housing cover, and they were widespread across the housing cover gradient. So they're turning up pretty much everywhere, but they tend to prefer suburbs that have more housing, which I guess more modified spaces. For tree cover, as we might expect, our urban avoiders were a massive fan of tree cover. So birds like the grey shrike thrush here were typically absent from suburbs until our tree cover got to around 50%. And then they showed a really strong positive relationship with tree cover. So they're not there at all until we've got a really decent amount of tree cover present in a suburb. Our urban adapters, like the pied currawong, again showed a positive relationship with tree cover, but they were quite widespread, less fussy about where they were occurring. And finally, our exploit.
Sorry, Jacinta, we've lost you again. Let me just find you. There we go.
So, can you hear me now?
Yes, we've got you.
Yeah, someone must be accidentally muting me.
No, you've gone again, Jacinta.
Can you hear me?
We can. I'm nowhere near the mute button.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I can see everything at once. Okay.
It's okay, we've got you.
So our urban exploiters, like the common blackbird, were showing the opposite trend to the other two groups. So they were actually declining with tree cover. They were less likely to occur in suburbs that had more tree cover. So they're kind of preferring to hang out in spaces where more trees had been cleared, which was quite interesting. And in looking at this, something that I personally found really interesting was that almost half of the bird species that I was able to study actually responded to a combination of both housing cover and tree cover. And most of these species looked similar to the Eastern Rosella here. So this is an example of an urban adapter. And I've tried to include both housing cover and tree cover on the same graph here. So we can see that with our housing cover, which is in grey, they are showing a really strong negative relationship with housing cover, or they're less likely to occur as housing cover increases. And then they've got the opposite response to tree cover. They're more likely to occur with greater tree cover. And that's what most of our species looked like. But then there were a few, like the common starling here, which is an exploiter, that actually declined with both housing cover and tree cover. So this tells me that starlings and a couple of other species like magpie larks and welcome swallows are actually selecting suburbs that have both fewer houses and fewer trees. So they're mainly hanging out in areas that are much more open, that are, development hasn't reached yet, but the area's potentially already been cleared, say, for example, for past agriculture or something. That's their prime kind of areas to hang out. So we've seen that ongoing urban development can be beneficial for some species, but it's generally negative for most of our birds. Because urban avoiders, adapters, and exploiters will differ in their habitat requirements and their ability to tolerate change, we may expect that ongoing urban development will result in a shift in community composition. And what I mean by this is that the species that coexist together within a suburb can change over time as that suburb becomes more and more developed. And we may even see some species disappear entirely and just not be able to hang in there. So for this section of my PhD, I wanted to know which properties of my suburbs were influencing the composition of birds that lived there, and how that composition was actually changing with increasing development, and were we losing any particular species along the way? What I found was that there were 6 key drivers of community composition in my suburbs. So once again, housing cover and tree cover were really important, as was the extent of surrounding vegetation. So that's the native veg around each of my suburbs. The proportion of tree cover that was made up of exotic trees was important. The cover of parklands, and finally, a new one, the relative abundance of noisy miners. I'm going to talk more about noisy miners in a moment, and I'm sure many of you are aware, but noisy miners are a native honey eater, and they do belong here in Melbourne, absolutely. But unfortunately, they're an incredibly aggressive and territorial species, and they form these kind of colonies with themselves and all of their family members, and they will just take over an area. And because they're so territorial, they will actually physically push other birds out of the area, and they'll just monopolize all the resources. And as I've seen in my research, can have a really strong impact on which birds are able to coexist within that suburb. So we know what's potentially influencing the composition of our birds, but how does it actually change as things like housing cover increase or tree cover declines? Our suburbs that have low housing cover and less development, they tended to have a really diverse bird community, which differed from suburb to suburb. So if I was to say drive around to different suburbs of Melbourne that had fewer houses, I'd always be seeing different birds, or I guess variation between suburbs. There might be a few core ones that were everywhere, but then the other ones that made up the community were always changing. And we would expect to see this because our birds have evolved to coexist with particular vegetation types, and that vegetation may change across Greater Melbourne. As we move up the housing cover gradient, though, into areas of high housing cover, the bird communities almost filtered so that only the most tolerant species are able to hang in there and exist in these highly modified suburbs. And what we end up with is fewer species overall, but also it's the same suite of species repeated again and again in these high density suburbs. So if I drive around different suburbs with lots of housing, it's always the same ones. There's no variation. It's the same, 15 birds or so that are turning up everywhere. And we can see that represented here. So I'm aware these plots are a little bit scary to look at first, but on the left, we have the native birds, and on the right, we have our bush birds. So these graphs are comparing the level of dissimilarity or the difference in species that make up a community in suburbs that have low, medium, and high housing cover. So what we can see is that the suburbs with low and medium housing cover tend to have greater dissimilarity or more differences in their community composition. So that's where we're seeing slightly different birds when we're moving between different suburbs. It's not always the same few. For both bird groups, both our native birds and our bush birds, suburbs that had high housing cover have less dissimilarity. So this means that their communities are becoming more and more similar with greater urban development. And when I looked into this a little bit further, I found that it's a particular suite of birds that we are losing from our more developed suburbs. And this is what's causing the communities to become more similar. And this group of birds are our insectivores. So they may well be birds that are feeding on insects down at the ground level, in the more of the mid-story vegetation, or up in the canopy. Any birds that are feeding on insects seem to be the ones that are disappearing. And these are some examples of those guys. So suburbs with low housing cover and less development tended to be home to these types of species. So our superb fairy wrens, striated pardalotes, grey fantails, olive-backed orioles, fan-tailed cuckoos, and eastern yellow robins. As we moved up that housing gradient into more developed areas of Melbourne, I started to see less of these species and more of these guys. So in these more developed areas, we're seeing more aggressive honey eaters like red wattlebirds, also more lorikeets like our musk lorikeet. There's more granivores, so these are birds that feed on grain and seeds like the crested pigeon, and more carnivores like the pied currawong. And of course, as we might expect, there's also more introduced or invasive species like the common blackbird and the rock dove. So far, we've seen that particular groups or assemblages of birds are more vulnerable to urban development than others. So groups like the bush birds or urban avoiders or insectivores, there's really a lot of overlap between these different classifications. I'm mainly talking about the same suite of birds, just with different names. We've also seen noisy miners are a little bit of a problem in our suburbs because of the ways that they can influence community composition. So because of this, in the last component of my PhD, I wanted to focus solely on our noisy miners and our bush birds to try and get a better understanding of what makes our streets, our parks, our gardens good habitat for these two different groups. What's the perfect habitat for a noisy miner, and what's the perfect habitat for a bush bird? So starting with our noisy miners, my results suggested that these birds love native canopy trees, or in this case, I'm largely talking about gum trees here, eucalypts. They were especially keen on sites that have lots of large, mature eucalypts. So we're talking trees that are 100 years old at least. That was kind of exactly what they were after. But they were not a big fan of shrubs. So they tended to be less abundant or less likely to occur at sites that had more shrub cover, especially in our residential streets. They were avoiding those places. And this is what their preferred habitat looks like. Wide, open spaces with a heavily mown understory of exotic lawn, very few or no shrubs at all, and a few scattered gum trees. And this type of vegetation occurs in our streets, as you can see in that top left photo, but it's most common in our urban parks. And you've probably been to parks like this before. Unfortunately, this is what most of our parks look like in suburban Melbourne. And noisy miners love these places because they're really well evolved to exist in these more open habitats. They're known as edge specialists. So in their natural environment, they would be hanging out on the edge of a woodland, perched up high in a eucalypt, where they can easily survey their territory. And that's exactly what they're doing in our parks. They're going to sit up high in a eucalypt and kind of chase off anything that turns up. And obviously that might be bush birds or other species of native birds, but they'll also have a go at dogs, cats, children. There's a professor at my university, Professor Mike Clark, who tells a story about a noisy miner chasing a Coke can down the road. They're pretty indiscriminate in what they will attack and chase away. So this is exactly where they will be hanging out. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, we've created endless spaces like this for noisy miners in our cities, which is undoubtedly leading to increases in the number of noisy miners and also helping them to colonize new areas and set up new colonies. So all in all, it's bad news for our native birds, especially those bush birds. If we focus on our bush birds, my results found that they really loved native canopy trees, the same as noisy miners. They were super keen on those eucalypts, but unlike noisy miners, they also wanted their sites to have mid-story vegetation and shrubs. So they needed all three levels, if you will, or all three layers of vegetation. Unsurprisingly, they're not very keen on noisy miners. They were less likely to occur at sites that had a greater abundance of noisy miners. And this is what their preferred habitat looks like. So we've got examples of sites that have lots of tall, mature gum trees, not just a few scattered ones, but they're actually creating more of a canopy where the canopies are touching, and heaps of mid-story and understory vegetation that's creating that really important structure. And these areas of understory and mid-story, it's not just about food and nesting resources. This structure is what gives them places to hide. And in urban areas, that's so important because they're potentially going to be hiding from people, dogs, cats, and of course, hiding from noisy miners. And the really great thing about having more of that shrub and mid-story vegetation is that it makes it harder for noisy miners to defend their territories. And I think this is why the noisy miners were avoiding areas with more shrubs, because they can't get a clear line of sight. They can't sit up high in their tree and easily see everything that's in their territory because there's shrubs in the way. So that's another reason why they're really great. And I do want to emphasize that these photos were not taken at some lovely bush reserve, 50 kilometers from Melbourne. These are all sites that I visited in suburban Melbourne. The top left image is an area of parkland that follows a creek, and it's got lots of lovely structure along the creek there for birds. And the bottom right photo is one I want to focus on in particular, because that's actually someone's nature strip. So if I quickly jump back to that other horrible photo, too far. Here, the top left, that's what a lot of our nature strips look like. It's probably what nature strips look like where you are. We've got this just lawn, and you're lucky if you've got a street tree. That's it. Whereas in this particular suburb, they had actually thought outside the box a little bit, and they'd started to bring some native vegetation, and potentially exotic, back to their nature strips, which was really, really great to see. So it's an example of what's possible in an urban setting. It doesn't just have to be heavily mown lawn and maybe a single gum tree. We can have streets that are green and biodiverse and providing habitat for a range of species. So in Melbourne in particular, our nature strips actually make up around 30% of the total open green space that we have available to us. So they're a pretty large area on the scale of our city, and they're just hugely underutilized as potential habitat. So what makes a suburb more bird friendly? I have a couple of things that I will emphasize. Having less housing cover is obviously really important if we want to maximize our bird diversity, but this is a big challenge. When we have a growing human population, people have to live somewhere, so we're going to need to make compromises with regards to housing cover. Having more intact patches of native vegetation. We know this is really important for the diversity of our bush birds in particular, as we think these areas are forming source habitat for a range of species. So this is where they're spending most of their life cycle. It's where they're probably breeding, and every now and then they're going to be venturing to our backyards. So we need to be retaining those patches of vegetation wherever they occur. Having more tree cover, which is preferably native tree cover, is going to be really important for a range of individual bird species, especially our avoiders and adapters. And it's also playing a role in keeping our community composition diverse and more representative of the birds that would occur in Melbourne prior to development. Having fewer noisy miners would also be lovely. This is super important for community composition and also just for the occurrence of our bush birds, because they are so aggressive and territorial. And finally, having more of that vegetation structure, so that mid-story and that shrub level. This is what is going to make sites suitable for a range of different bush species. So what can you do to help native birds in your own garden, if you're lucky enough to have one, in your courtyard, your balcony, whatever it is that you have? If you happen to have native mature trees on your property, please keep them. They are so important in an urban space. And unfortunately, at least within Melbourne, so many of the trees that we are losing are being cleared from private land. So it's so important that we keep whatever we have. If your council allows it, see if you can get a street tree. A lot of nature strips are totally bare, just with grass and nothing else. So some councils will allow you to request a tree, and they will come and plant one that they feel is appropriate for the site, the climate, etc. And if your council is really, really great, they might even allow you to revegetate your nature strip and go out there and plant more of those understory plants on the nature strip itself. If you have a garden that you manage, have access to, please be considering native Indigenous plant species and think about bringing in that structure, those multiple layers, because that's how we're going to provide habitat for a diverse bird community. And BirdLife Australia have some fantastic resources available on that. So absolutely go check out their website. They can point you in the right direction. You can also think about adding some additional resources for birds. So things like nest boxes for some of our hollow nesting parrot species. Bird baths are fantastic, especially as we're coming into summer, and it's probably going to be a very, very hot summer. You've probably seen, I have a cat. I actually have two. It's super important that we're keeping our cats indoors or contained at least within a secure outdoor enclosure. So my cats are predominantly indoor only. They do have access to an outdoor enclosure. There is no way that they can physically come into contact with any birds or mammals or reptiles or anything, just the odd insect that unfortunately turns up. So I've basically dedicated my little backyard to my cats, and my little front yard is for the birds and for other native wildlife. So that's where I have a nest box and a bird bath and various Indigenous plants. And finally, contribute to citizen science. I'm sure you've all heard about this, but it wouldn't be a BirdLife Australia webinar if I didn't mention the Aussie Bird Count. So the Aussie Bird Count is an Australian-wide bird census that happens every year in October. This year is actually the 10th year that it's been running, and anyone can take part in this, whether they're 6 years old through to 106 years old. And you can record bird observations from anywhere in the country. So it could be on your street, down the local park, at the beach, in your backyard, wherever works for you. All the observations you record go to BirdLife Australia, and they directly inform their conservation action plans. So they're currently writing a plan to conserve birds in Australian cities, which is going to be the first of its kind. So the information that you collect in the Aussie Bird Count is really, really valuable. So if you'd like to participate this year, note down the 16th to the 22nd of October and go check out their website. The final thing you can do is to spread the word about my research, not for my sake, but for the sake of our native birds. So often what happens in science is we write these long academic theses, it's what I'm doing at the moment, and complicated journal articles that'll get published somewhere, but they're never read by the people who actually matter. And I really want to change that. So I want to see that my research is read by people who can actually make a difference in the way that our residential suburbs are designed and managed. And that's where I really need your help. I'm currently putting together a brochure that summarizes the major findings of my PhD, many of which I have mentioned this evening. And I want to get this brochure in front of people who are working in local governance, urban planning and design, landscape architecture, wildlife gardening programs, conservation organizations, and local community groups. So if you would like a digital copy of this brochure, once it is finished, it is still a work in progress, either for your own personal interest or perhaps on behalf of an organization that you work with or you're affiliated with, please jump onto that URL that's on the screen, or you can scan a different QR code and just fill out the short form that I've put together there. So it just asks for your name, your email address, and the name of any organization you're affiliated with. And then I can send you a copy once it's completed. Thank you all so much for joining me online tonight. If you do have any questions, please scan the QR code on the right of your screen. That's the one for tonight's webinar. You're also welcome, of course, to contact me via my email address at the top there, or you can reach out on social media if you happen to use it. I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors and co-authors in this work, Professor Andrew Bennett, who I believe may be here, and Dr. Angie Haslam, as well as the generous organisations who funded my research, including BirdLife Australia. I'd also like to thank Dr. Holly Parsons and Dr. Annie Naimo for inviting me along today. Thank you all, and I welcome your questions.
Amazing, Jacinta. Thank you so much. Such a great talk with some really practical recommendations, which are amazing. And there are a whole host of questions. We're quite short on time, so I'm going to cherry pick.
Sorry.
Apologies, people, if I don't get to everything. Let's go with whether, firstly, the recommendations you're making, do you think they apply to all over Australia? Can we take what you've learned in Melbourne and apply it elsewhere?
Yeah, ideally, you're probably going to see a different bird community if you're up in Brisbane, certainly, up in the tropics and that. But I like to think that what I have found is applicable in other cities. Absolutely.
Great. A couple of questions on methodology. Let's maybe do those ones first. When you did your bird surveys, were you sampling at the same time every day for each site? Was the weather changing? So what sort of consistency did you have with your surveys?
Yeah. So I guess I'll touch on weather first. I was never out when it was windy or it was raining. They were my two no-goes. So I had particular cutoff points. So I was always out when it was calm and dry. And then in terms of time of day, I was alternating the time that I was visiting different suburbs. So I mentioned I went to each suburb 5 times over the course of my fieldwork, and I would be alternating between early morning, so at sunrise, versus late morning, which was kind of around, like, obviously the timing changed throughout the year, but after I finished my first suburb, I would go to the second one immediately after. Probably should have been surveying everything bang on sunrise, but unfortunately I didn't have the time in a PhD program to do that. Kind of had to condense things a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joanne asked in the chat in Teams, did high density housing areas have parks? And if so, did the parks make up for the lack of trees in the housing themselves?
Yeah. So parks were really tricky. So I mentioned parks a couple of times. I didn't go into any great detail, but a lot of the parks actually didn't have amazing tree cover, unfortunately. Um, they were often just these large grassy areas, which of course are wonderful for kicking a footy around or having a picnic, but not great in terms of habitat. So yes, they often did have areas of parkland, but they certainly weren't lovely bushy parklands.
Sounds very similar to around my place too. Next question is, does the size of the green patch and the availability of habitat corridors influence the diversity of species that you saw?
Yes. So one thing I didn't mention that I looked at was also patches of habitat within each of my suburbs and kind of the size of those patches, and definitely having larger patches of intact native vegetation was always a good thing. But of course, they're not present in a lot of the suburbs I surveyed in, unfortunately. That is it's been lost over time.
Were you able to tell a difference between high density apartment living where green spaces were around versus lower density housing, but where the house takes up the bulk of the property?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I largely avoided areas that had apartment complexes. I wasn't really in that inner city kind of level of urban development. It was more what you would consider suburbia and just different levels of suburbia. So more or less the block size is getting smaller, and we're seeing more of the house taking up each individual block rather than having large high-rise apartment towers or something like that.
Right. Okay, so we talked about noisy miners. There's been a couple of questions about common or Indian miners. So firstly, are they dislodging native birds in a destructive way? And if they are, what can we do about it?
Yeah, so I didn't explicitly look at common miners in the same way that I did noisy miners. And the main reason for that is they were nowhere near as widespread. So noisy miners were in every single suburb I visited, and almost every single site. It was 90 something% of sites had noisy miners present, and common miners just were not that widespread at all. So we felt that we would focus on the noisies because they were clearly everywhere. There's definitely been some research done into common miners that suggests that they're very territorial around nest boxes and tree hollows, which is where they breed. So it looks as though they are definitely a problem there. But from my own observations, I don't think they're as big an issue as the indiscriminate aggressive behavior that I've seen with noisy miners.
Yep. Thanks, Jacinta. And I think that's similar to sort of findings from other research as well, that Indian or common miners can be particularly problematic around sort of hollows because they will get into hollows, but they tend to be in the higher urban dense areas.
Yes.
And less in sort of the bushier habitats.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm quite conscious of the time. There's lots of people asking about links to brochures and things. So what we'll do is we're going to take the recording from today. We'll pop it up on our YouTube channel. I think Annie's popped a link in the chat in Teams. And so that will go up there, and then we will send everybody out an email within the next few days that has a link to the recording so you can watch it again and you can share it with people. And we'll also include links to Jacinta's work as well. So you can read more about it and you can get on her list there. just really quickly, there was a report in today's paper suggesting some birds had been poisoned. How can we educate residents on the value of birds? I've got some thoughts, but do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think Holly's more qualified in the education space, but I would start with the Aussie bird count because it's coming up in a few weeks. See if you can get people in your local community involved, whether that's through a school, your workplace, your neighbours, whoever it is, and just get them to spend 20 minutes outside seeing what birds turn up. And I think people are often amazed at what can turn up in their street or their park if they've never sat there and done that before. It is really challenging if they're not supportive, but I guess everyone starts somewhere.
Yeah, that's similar to what I was going to say, Jacinta. I think the Aussie bird count's a great opportunity to get people who are not experienced birdos to get out and ID some birds. And for the most part, I think everybody has a bird story. Even if they don't know the name of the bird, they'll be able to tell you like some sort of incident they've had with a bird. They've got a memory linked to a bird, and so tapping into that is really important. And really easy to do. Just have a conversation. The other thing that you could think about is Bird of the Year is on right now as well. So that's a BirdLife Australia and the Guardian Australia competition. It's and we're in the knockout rounds now. So if you are interested, go to the Guardian website, vote for your favourite bird out of the 40, I think, that are left in the list. Vote every day and see if your favourite can be crowned, and open the conversation. Ask people about what their favourite bird is and see who likes what on the list. There's some good ones still there. So have a look at that. I think we're probably at time now. There's been some amazing comments and some amazing questions coming through. Jacinta's popped her contact details on the screen. Remember, you can always contact us at the Urban Birds team as well. You get emails coming through from me. Feel free to pop me an email and either myself or one of the team can answer your questions. But thank you everyone for coming along tonight. A massive thank you to Jacinta for sharing your research. It was wonderful to hear just how well it has gone and all the really exciting recommendations that have come out about that. And it's really important. We need to get that out to local councils. We need to talk to state planners about how to better design our urban spaces for birds. And so when those recommendations are available, share them with your local councils, get in and start that conversation. That's a really good way to go about getting some changes made from the ground up as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. Remember, we will have another session next month. I'm not going to give away what the topic is yet, but keep an eye out for the invite email. It's going to be a really nice one. I'm really excited. Thank you again. If you've got any questions at any time, remember just to let us know, and we will follow up with everybody with the recording shortly. Good night, everyone.